So let me give you a quick review. If you can't see me, you might have to shift because I'm probably not going to move. Week number 1, we covered from AD 400 up to the late 1300s, ending talking about John Wycliffe. Week number 2, we went from the late 1300s up to the early 1400s. And today we're going to start at 1425 approximately. And we'll see how far we get. On my pages here, I go up to 1547, the death of King Henry VIII. So we'll see if we get that far or not. My intention, the plan here is I'm going to go up to the King James Version in 1611. It's going to take me at least 2 weeks, including tonight, possibly 3 weeks to get there. And then, so we've been talking about how we got the Bible in English. I'm going to stop there and go back to some other things. So once I get there, we're going to take a week at least and talk about the canon of Scripture, which has to do with how did the books that are in the Bible get there, and what about all the books that didn't make it into the Bible? Why didn't they make it into the Bible? We'll talk about, they're referred to as apocryphal literature, Old Testament and New Testament times. We'll talk a bit about how come in Roman Catholic Bibles they have another whole section of books called the Apocrypha, which is not in Protestant Bibles. What's the deal with that? After we finish that, which we might be able to do in 1 week, we'll see. And actually that week's very important. Remember when the book, the Da Vinci Code came out, and then there was a movie about it? A pastor in Trenton, the pastor at the Crossing is the name of the church? Crossroads? Crossroads, yeah. He called me up and said, man, I'm getting a lot of questions about this book, the Da Vinci Code, and I don't know how to answer them. Will you come and talk to the church about this? So I said, well, the problem is I've not even read the book. So give me some time. I had to read the book first, and then so that book was very influential. And one of the questions it raises is this whole subject of the canon of Scripture. So we'll get to that. After that, we're going to talk about textual criticism. And some people have already asked the question, how do we know that the version of the Bible we have is accurate, basically? And how do scholars decide when there's thousands of manuscripts and thousands of different readings in some places? How do scholars decide what should be in and what shouldn't be in? So we're going to talk about that. Eventually we'll talk about different translations, the problems of translating from one language into another. And so that will get into what's the difference between, there's a multitude of different translations at this point in English. How do you pick one that's appropriate for you? What's the differences? That sort of thing. So that's where we're headed. So tonight we're going to start talking about a guy named William Tyndale. I had my notes sitting on the floor, and my dog came and laid on it and dribbled. So the spot is still there, it hasn't dried up yet. Well, yeah. Tonight in particular, in the next few weeks, will be perfect illustrations of what I've been saying each week. It's impossible to talk about how we got the Bible without also talking about church history and secular history, especially in England, especially in the time we're talking about. They are so intertwined that it's impossible to separate them. And so I've done my best to lay this out in chronological order so that you can understand, here's some of the things that were happening in the church, here's some of the things that were happening in the secular government, and how us getting the Bible in English is all intertwined with that. So here we go. William Tyndale. He's the guy who produced this book. For many years in England, if you were caught with this book in your hand, you would be killed. And so I'm going to pass it around. This is actually a photocopy of one of the printed versions. This came out in 1526. So I'll pass that around so you can have a look. I actually thought about showing a movie tonight. I have a DVD movie about William Tyndale, but it would take 94 minutes. And so I thought, well, I don't want to spend the whole night on him, so we're just going to talk about him instead. So Tyndale, he got his BA in 1512, got his master's degree 1515 from Oxford University. He then switches to Cambridge University, where he studied for 4 years. 1521, he becomes a chaplain and a tutor. He's a gifted linguist, and he speaks 8 languages. He's fluent in French, Greek, Hebrew, German, Italian, Latin, Spanish, and English. He's like a genius. Somewhere between 1521 and 1523, he begins working on an English translation of the New Testament. What is different, for the first time in history, he is translating the New Testament from Greek instead of from the Latin Vulgate, which up until then, all previous translations had been made from the Latin Vulgate, which was produced by Jerome in 405 AD. He's using, last week we talked about the famous Erasmus, and he is using the second edition of Erasmus's Greek New Testament, which came out in 1522. Now, Tyndale has some Protestant leanings and is soon in trouble with his Roman Catholic superiors. In one argument that's recorded, one of his clergy superiors says to him, "We would be better off without God's laws than to be without the Pope's laws." Tyndale responded, "I defy the Pope and all his laws, and if God spares my life before many years, I will cause the boy that drives the plow to know more of the scriptures than you do." So that's a pretty bold statement that Tyndale thinks, by producing that little book going around, that some boy that works in the field will know more than some bishop in the church. 1524, Tyndale realizes it's too dangerous to do this work in England, so he moves to Europe. Remember last week we talked about a law in England called the Constitutions of Oxford, which was passed in 1409, which makes it illegal, and this is still in force at this time. It is illegal to translate the Bible in English. It is illegal to read the Bible in English. He's taken his life in his hands. He's disobeying the law of the land by translating the Bible into English. That's why he has to leave England to do it, or else he's going to get killed. 1525, he finishes that book that's going around. It's an English book. However, of course, it cannot be printed in England. It's printed in Germany and in Belgium, and then it's smuggled into England and Scotland. Within 5 years, 15,000 copies have been printed. There's a lot of demand for this book. The church hierarchy in England immediately condemns the book as heresy and burns any copies that can be found. In fact, the Bishop of London travels to Europe and travels around buying every single copy he can find so that he can burn them. 1526, twice a year that are recorded, March and October, huge piles of that book are piled in front of St. Paul's Cathedral in London and are set on fire. Meanwhile, around the rest of Europe, in 1526, the first complete Dutch Bible is printed. Same year, the first New Testament in Swedish is printed. Same year, the first complete Danish Bible is printed. Now, looking aside at the secular world, in 1527, Henry's first wife, anyone remember Henry's first wife? This is Henry VIII we're talking about.
Mary?
No, the first wife is Catherine of Aragon from Spain. She has given birth 6 times, but only one child has survived for more than a few weeks. That child who survived is Mary, who will later become Queen Mary I. However, Henry desperately wants a male heir. So he begins the process of, he wants to divorce Catherine. She cannot produce a male child. In his thinking, get rid of her. Meanwhile, Henry has had numerous affairs and has had an illegitimate son. He's also fallen in love, quote marks, with a woman named Anne Boleyn. 1529, Ulrich Zwingli and John Calvin over in Switzerland, they produce what's called the Zurich Bible in Swiss German. So people wanting the Bible in their own language is happening all over Europe. Same year, because of this divorce issue, let me just back up slightly. Henry wants to divorce Catherine. Now, as you may recall, Catherine was the widow of his older brother. He had married her. He wants a divorce, but the Roman Catholic Church and the Pope will not allow him to have a divorce. Therefore, he breaks the Church of England away from the Pope. And this is a very significant move that happens in 1529, and then he basically gets officials in the Church of England to annul his marriage. So mission accomplished. The problem that this creates for many Protestants, they think, oh, the Church of England has now broken with the Roman Catholic Church. I can get away with some Protestant things and translating the Bible perhaps. Well, that is not the case, because Henry in his mind is still very much a Roman Catholic. All that's happened is he's broken with the Pope so that he can get his divorce. In 1968, a guy named John Joseph Scarisbrick wrote a 561-page book about King Henry VIII. And I thought his summary in one sentence is this genius. He says, "Few kings have had it in their power to do greater good than Henry VIII, and few have done less." 1929, Tyndale revises the New Testament and begins working on translating the Old Testament from Hebrew into English. He doesn't finish this because he gets killed before he can finish it.
Sorry, did you say 1929?
1529. Yeah. 1529, Tyndale is officially condemned in England as a heretic for translating the Bible into English. So he's in deep trouble now. 1530, the British Parliament confirms Henry VIII as, quote, the protector and supreme head of the English Church. Which is quite a title. The king, who is basically a scoundrel, is the official protector and supreme head of the English Church. The same year, another pile of Tyndale's New Testaments are burned in front of St. Paul's Cathedral. Same year, the first New Testament in Italian is published. Same year, the first complete French Bible is published. It's translated, of course, from the Latin Vulgate, not from Greek or Hebrew. In 1530, Tyndale, remember he's living in Europe at this time, he's pretty bold. He writes a pamphlet in which he opposes the annulment of the marriage of King Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon. At this point, Henry VIII is absolutely furious, he asked the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V. In Europe, there were a group of countries that was considered the Holy Roman Empire. Charles V is the emperor. Henry VIII asked Charles V, find this guy, I want to have him killed. Now we'll take a little break from Tyndale, and we're going to talk about a guy named Thomas Bilney. We mentioned him last week. He studied at Cambridge University. Tim, you're keeping up with all these pictures? Okay. Went to Cambridge University, became a priest in 1519 at the age of 24. He's friends with William Tyndale, Matthew Parker, who later became the Archbishop of Canterbury, Hugh Latimer, who became a bishop and was the chaplain of King Edward VI. Unfortunately, he later gets burned at the stake by Queen Mary. I mentioned last week, at some point, he's reading the Greek New Testament, and he read one verse, and God pierced his heart with that verse, and he was converted. The interesting thing, he was already a priest, but he has a conversion experience. In most matters, he remained a solid Roman Catholic. However, he did preach against three things. Number one, the veneration or worship of saints and relics. Who knows what a saint is in the Roman Catholic Church?
Somebody who's been esteemed as a holy person living a holy life for most of their life.
Yeah, basically that's it. So they're highly esteemed. The problem is they had become more than highly esteemed. They were almost worshipped. And who knows what a relic is? Not Steve Sweetman. Not your car.
A holy symbol that they use in significance in the church.
Yeah, and so it could be, someone joked one time, if you added up all the genuine pieces of the cross scattered throughout Europe, you could probably build a gigantic building. So it could be a piece, they say this came from the cross of Jesus, or this was the big toe of Steve Sweetman, or whatever it was. Lots of bones and things. And so people would honor, venerate, basically worship some of these relics. Anyway, Thomas Bilney didn't think that was appropriate. He also questioned the merits of going on pilgrimages, which was where, in order to gain merit with God, you would go on a journey to venerate some relic, maybe on the other side of the country or something, and you would get sort of like brownie points, so to speak, for doing that. And he also preached against praying to saints to have them pass on your prayer to God. And so if, let's say, Steve Sweetman is a saint, then the thinking, and someone can correct me if I'm wrong on this, basically I pray to Steve and then hope that Steve will take that prayer to Jesus, because I'm not worthy of going directly to Jesus. I had to go through a mediator. So Thomas Bilney preached against those three things. You may have seen some pictures up here. In 1527, he's been banned from preaching in any churches. But he starts preaching outdoors, of all things. So he's in the middle of an outdoor sermon when he's dragged from the pulpit and arrested for heresy and thrown in the Tower of London. He's released 2 years later, but is rearrested 2 years after that. As part of his punishment, he is forced to light a pile of Tyndale New Testaments on fire, not in front of St. Paul's Cathedral, but in St. Paul's Cathedral. 1531, Thomas Bilney is taken to Lollard's Pit. A Lollard, as we learned the first week, was one of the followers of John Wycliffe. And it's called Lollard's Pit because that's where the church killed a lot of the followers of John Wycliffe. And he's burned at the stake there. He's 36 years old. Interestingly, the local Church of England bishop who presided over this, his name is Richard Nix, he watches him die, and then he says, I fear I have burned Abel and let Cain go. The bishop says, as he watches this man die, he says, I fear I have burned Abel and let Cain go. 1532, the first complete Bible in Italian is published. 1533, King Henry VIII marries Anne Boleyn. This is wife number 2, even though he's still married to Catherine of Aragon. But Anne was pregnant, and they had already been living together for a while Henry was fighting to get a divorce from Catherine. So he just proceeded. 1533 in May, Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, declares that Henry's marriage to Catherine is annulled and that his marriage to Anne Boleyn is legal. So that solves the problem for Henry. In September that year, Anne Boleyn gives birth to Elizabeth. Now remember, Henry already had a daughter named Mary from his first wife. He now has a daughter, Elizabeth, from his second wife. Later on, she becomes Queen Elizabeth I, and she will rule England for 45 years. Also interestingly, once Elizabeth is born, Mary is pushed aside. She's basically disowned. Now we're going to talk about a guy named John Frith. Last week I talked about a tavern. The English Reformation started in a pub called the White Horse Inn or the White Horse Tavern. The son of that tavern owner is John Frith. He was the innkeeper. So he becomes friends with William Tyndale, who produced this book, and Thomas Bilney, who we just talked about. He goes to Eton College, Cambridge University, and Oxford University. In 1528, at the age of 25, he's arrested for possession of heretical books, being this book and books by Martin Luther. He's thrown in jail for 6 months, but eventually somehow gets released and he moves to Europe. He's a bold guy. He writes several books while he's in Europe against the Roman Catholic doctrines of purgatory and transubstantiation. And then in 1532...
Can you explain?
Okay, someone correct me if I'm wrong on this. The idea of purgatory, and we'll get more into this in a moment here, is when you die, you're still a sinner. And so you go to a place called purgatory where you suffer for however many thousands of years it takes until you're purified, and then you can go to heaven. Transubstantiation is a Roman Catholic doctrine whereby the communion, the piece of bread, literally, actually, physically becomes the actual physical body of Jesus when the priest blesses it. And so that's what that was. There were 3 main views on communion. One is transubstantiation. The second, propounded by Martin Luther, is called consubstantiation, whereby the presence of the Lord is actually present here, but it's not physically a piece of Jesus. And then the Anabaptists, for example, believe that in communion it's a memorial, basically. You're remembering Jesus. So most, this church would believe in the third option.
About purgatory, I think
Yeah.
the understanding more is that it's a holding pattern. It's like a holding place. I've never ever heard anything about suffering there, but that people can pray them out of there, or it wouldn't be good enough to go straight to heaven. So it's like people hope that their loved one is going to go to heaven and then, have eternal rest eventually.
Okay. 1532, for some reason, John Frith returns to England and he's immediately arrested by command of Sir Thomas More. He's thrown in the Tower of London for 8 months. The next year he has a trial before the Archbishop of Canterbury and other bishops. He argues that the doctrines of purgatory and transubstantiation are man-made doctrines that cannot be proven from Scripture. And let me just back up here. I took part in a Alpha course a few years ago, and there were a lot of Roman Catholics in that Alpha course. And in the discussion time after the videos, I was hearing a lot of weird stuff, and I was keeping my mouth shut. And so I phoned the person who was in charge of it, who was a Roman Catholic, and saying, man, I'm hearing a lot of weird stuff in these small groups. And she said, the basic problem here is the source of authority, that you Protestants have one source of authority, and that's the Bible. We Catholics have two sources of authority, the Bible and church tradition, and they're equal. And so there's a lot of things that they might not be in the Bible, but they're part of church tradition, therefore they are legitimate. And so that's basically what's happening here. This guy is arguing that it's not in the Bible, therefore I'm not going to believe it, whereas the church authorities would say, well, it doesn't matter whether it's in the Bible or not, it's part of our tradition, therefore you better believe it. But because he doesn't believe it, he's burned at the stake on July 4th. He's 30 years old. I'll just make a little aside. At that time, there's 3 types of getting executed. If you're rich, you get your head chopped off, which is relatively quick. If you're poor, and the beheading happens, it's a semi-private affair, like going to the hospital. You have a semi-private room, and so there's just a handful of people there when you get your head chopped off. If you're a poor person, you get hung publicly. And so this was a big community event. There could be hundreds of people watch you get hung. However, if you are convicted of a religious crime, such as having this book, then you will be burned at the stake, which is a public event. And so that's we're going to start hearing about burning at the stake. That's what happened to John Frith. It's the penalty for a religious crime that you're burned. 1533, Henry VIII is officially excommunicated by the Pope. That means he's going to hell, as far as the Catholic Church would be concerned. 1534, Martin Luther publishes the complete Bible in German. He had published the New Testament in German in 1522. 1534, Tyndale revises the New Testament again, so he keeps on doing this. 1534, the same year, the Act of Supremacy. So this, we've already talked about this a little bit, but this act officially makes Henry VIII the official head of the Church of England. So he has the power now to make ecclesiastical appointments. If he wants L. Reimers to be a bishop, boom, you're a bishop. It doesn't matter what your background is or anything. And it's also now the king who decides doctrine. So in the Church of England, whether it's Orthodox or heresy, that's up to the king to decide what official doctrine will be. So from this time on, there's 4 things that can get you killed. Number 1, if you oppose Henry's annulment of his marriage to Catherine and putting Mary aside. So if you oppose his divorce, if you oppose his second marriage to Anne Boleyn, you're in trouble. If you oppose Henry's new position as the supreme head of the Church of England, you're going to be in trouble. If you say that the Pope is the head of the Church while in England, you're going to be in trouble. You can get executed for differing with any of those 4 things as of that date. Also, anyone in England can be required to take an oath. the police can come up to you, Gord, and say, we want you to make an oath that King Henry VIII is the supreme head of the church in England. If you refuse to take that oath, you're a goner. So after this time, it becomes actually, and I don't want to bore you with all the details, but people are getting executed left and right because they oppose one of those four things. It's quite routine. So, for example, in 1535, Sir Thomas More, who was one of the top guys in England, he gets his head chopped off because he refuses to swear the oath that King Henry VIII is the head of the church. The same year, 1535, Tyndale, the author of this book, gets arrested in Belgium by agents of Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor. He's held in jail for about 17 months. Now we're going to leave him, and we're jumping to Miles Coverdale. Tim? These people that we're encountering are very educated, knowledgeable people. He studies at Cambridge University, eventually becomes a Roman Catholic priest, although by the time of his death he had become a Protestant. From 1528 to 1535, because it was unsafe to do this in England, he moves to Europe and starts working on his English translation of the Bible. In 1535, he finishes editing his English version, and this becomes, first time in history, the first printed English version of the entire Bible. That happened in 1535. Of course, it cannot be printed in England. That would be illegal. So it gets printed in Europe.
So is that the New Testament?
That's the whole Bible. The old.
New and old.
Yeah. And so Tyndale had printed this in 1526.
Just the new.
Yeah, just the New Testament. And he started work on the Old Testament, but he only got about 7 books done before he ends up getting killed. And so Miles Coverdale comes along. He basically just uses Tyndale's New Testament, and he used the 7 books of the Old Testament that Tyndale had gotten to. He uses that, and then he kind of acts as an editor, and he gets other scholars to help him, and he finally produces the Old Testament, and then the whole thing gets printed. So remember, we talked about John Wycliffe in the late 1300s. He had produced a translation of the entire Bible, but that was written out by hand. And we had talked about how expensive it was, that it would cost you a year's wage to buy a Bible at that time. And then we had also talked about Gutenberg, who had printed the Latin Vulgate. That would cost you 3 years' wages to buy a Bible. So this gets, so we're talking about Miles Coverdale's version. It's printed in Switzerland and Belgium and becomes available in England in 1537. Now Coverdale is a very smart guy. He officially dedicates the book. There's a major dedication page. He dedicates the book to Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, his second wife. And so Henry is quite pleased with this. And he actually eventually allows it, for the first time in history, you can buy an English Bible in England. And it was this Bible. You can actually buy a copy online. I don't have one, but it'd be similar to this. It's like a photocopy of the Coverdale Bible. And here's another interesting thing. So this was translated in 1535. The Anglican Book of Common Prayer still uses his translation in the Book of Psalms, in the Book of Common Prayer. It's the 1535 version made by Coverdale that's used. 1536, Catherine of Aragon, Henry's first wife, dies a natural death. She had never accepted, she still lived in England, she had refused to accept that she had been divorced by Henry. So in 1536, by now, Anne Boleyn, this is Henry's second wife, She's had 2 stillborn children and 1 miscarriage. Not a good record. So Henry decides, guess what? Got to get rid of her. Meanwhile, Henry has continued to have affairs with various other women. So a few months after this, in May 1536, Anne is arrested on trumped-up charges of treason and is sent to the Tower of London. And then she gets her head chopped off. Basically for not producing a male heir.
Didn't you say it became legal to buy one of these Bibles?
That was around this time. I'm actually coming up to it. Well, I'm going to talk about it again. I'll talk about it when we get there. Now, here's an interesting thing. Anne Boleyn gets her head chopped off on May 19th, 1536. On May 20th, Henry gets engaged to his 3rd wife. The day after he cuts the head off his 2nd wife, he's engaged to his 3rd wife. 10 days after he gets engaged, he marries Jane Seymour. That's his 3rd wife. There's an act of Parliament, or he puts through this bill that suppresses not only Mary, who was pushed aside when he married his 2nd wife, but now Elizabeth is also pushed aside, and it becomes legal. Any children produced by the union of Henry VIII and Jane Seymour now, that person is going to become the next monarch. Now, the same year, this is 1536, in October 6th, Tyndale is given 2 death sentences for making this book. To get 2 death sentences, they had this wire that would go through a hole in the stake. We probably had some. Well, you're ahead of me there. That's not Tyndale. That's Miles Coverdale, I think. So they would choke you to death, strangle you, plus burn you at the stake at the same time. That's the way you can get 2 death sentences. So that's how Tyndale dies. As he dies, he yells out in a loud voice. And some of these pictures might show it. There it is right there. Lord, open the eyes of the King of England, is his prayer as he's dying in Belgium. His prayer is answered within 1 year, incredibly. And to answer your question, Steve, it's 1 year later, in 1537, that Henry VIII allows Miles Coverdale's translation of the whole Bible to be sold in England. And then to go even beyond that, we'll come to this, in 1539, Henry actually authorized the use of Coverdale's Great Bible. This is another translation. He allows, in English churches, the Bible to be read in English instead of Latin for the first time in history. That happened in 1539, and we'll come to that. So things are really hopping here at this point. But here's a quote from William Tyndale that I like. He says, "Scripture is a light and shows us the true way, both what to do and what to hope for, and a defense from all error, and a comfort in adversity that we despair not, and strengthens us in prosperity that we sin not." And so that's an interesting thing. He talks about, he gives us strength in adversity, but also in prosperity, that we don't go astray. Well, we're still talking about Tyndale. In his translation, he actually invented 2 words that had never occurred in the English language before. The word Passover and the word scapegoat did not exist before Tyndale. There's some common biblical phrases that come directly from this book that are still meaningful today. my brother's keeper. Knock and it shall be opened unto you. A moment in time. Seek and ye shall find. Ask and it shall be given you. Judge not that ye be not judged. Let there be light. The powers that be, the salt of the earth. It came to pass. The signs of the times. Filthy lucre. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. Live, move, and have our being. They're all phrases directly from this book that still have meaning today. Now, the church hierarchy in England hated some of the ways he translated Greek words. So, for example, instead of translating the Greek word as bishop, he translated as overseer, which has a whole different meaning when you're in a hierarchical system. Overseer instead of bishop. He translated another word, instead of translating it as priest, he translated it as elder. A totally different meaning. Instead of translating as charity, he translated as love. And one of his most significant changes in the Greek word ecclesia, instead of translating it as church, the way it had always been translated up to now, he translated it as congregation, which given the political environment meant something totally different. So Tyndale's famous in Christian circles. There's been 11 movies made about him, and there's a lot of Christian schools named after him. So coming back to your question, Steve, 1537, the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, persuades Henry VIII to allow Miles Coverdale's English translation of the whole Bible to be printed in England and sold in England. First time in history that you could legally buy an English Bible in England in 1537. Now we're going to talk about a guy named John Rogers. He's also educated at Cambridge University, and he becomes a priest. 1534, he travels to Belgium, and he meets William Tyndale and Miles Coverdale. He becomes a Protestant. 1537, he gets married. A priest gets married. And eventually, he has 11 children. So he enjoyed marriage. Now, it was still, in his opinion, dangerous to translate the Bible, so he uses a pseudonym, a fake name, and he publishes a translation of the Bible called Matthew's Bible. His name's not Matthew. And it's printed in France and Belgium, and it's a combination of earlier versions by Tyndale and Miles Coverdale. Eventually, though, it is allowed to be printed in England, and this is where the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, persuades King Henry VIII to give Rogers a license. So Coverdale had already had one of these licenses. Now Rogers gets a license. He's allowed to sell 1,500 copies in England. 1537, Jane Seymour gives birth to Henry's first legitimate son who lived, and his name is Edward. We're going to hear a lot more about him next week. So at this time, his half-sister Mary, from his first wife, is 21. His half-sister Elizabeth, from his second wife, is 4 years old. And now this is a son from the third wife. Sadly, 12 days after the birth, and this was not unusual at this time, Jane Seymour dies from complications from the birth. A year after this, 1538, by this time, every single monastery in England has been shut down, and Henry has confiscated all their property. We talked last week about how the Roman Catholic Church took 5 times as much money out of England as the government of England took. And so Henry was quite jealous of that income source. So he confiscates all the land and property of all the monasteries, and then he either keeps it for himself or distributes it to people that he likes. 1539. Henry forces Parliament to pass the Statute of 6 Articles. Remember I said in his mind, in his thinking, Henry's still a Roman Catholic, except for the Pope part. And so this list, and he's the head of the English Church. So he decides what is orthodox and what is heresy. He's the head of the church. Here's 6 Roman Catholic doctrines that he says must be adhered to by every person in England. Number 1, you must believe in transubstantiation. Number 2, lay people only get the bread, they don't get the wine in communion. Number 3, if you're a clergy person, you must be celibate. No marriage for ministers. Number 4, religious vows such as the vow of celibacy are permanent and lifelong. You can't change your mind later. Say, oh, I've changed my mind about being a monk or something. Number 5, private masses are to be made available rather than only congregational masses. So this would be the communion service that Henry wants that to be. You could just have a private one rather than a public one. Number 6, everyone in England must regularly make a verbal confession to a priest. These 6 doctrines, if you don't comply with all 6, your first offense, you go to jail, and everything you own is confiscated. You lose everything you own. For your second offense, you're killed. So these 6 doctrines are pretty important. 1539, a guy named Richard Taverner publishes his English translation, and it's a revision of Matthew's Bible. And then in 1539, the Great Bible comes out. It's called the Great Bible because it was large. And I went around in circles on the internet trying to find out how large. I couldn't figure it out. Everyone just says it's large. It's also edited by Miles Coverdale, who we saw earlier. So this is his second one. He produced a translation under his own name a number of years earlier. Now this version is called the Great Bible. Again, the New Testament basically is Tyndale's translation with a bunch of changes to bring it more in line with the Latin Vulgate rather than the Greek books. Again, in the Old Testament, he uses what Tyndale had translated and what Tyndale hadn't translated, because Coverdale actually didn't know Hebrew for the Old Testament, so he translates from the Latin Vulgate or from Luther's German translation into English. And so the Great Bible was in print for 30 years, which is a long time. The last printing was in 1569. And the second edition in 1540, he actually got the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, to write a preface for it. And so that is the Church of England giving some official recognition to this. So it was very popular. In just 2 years, by 1541, more than 9,000 copies had been printed. Meanwhile, 1540, the first New Testament in Icelandic is published. And so all around Europe, there seems to be a hunger for people to get the Bible in their own language. Because up until then, as I said in previous weeks, if you went to church, the entire service, other than perhaps the sermon, was in Latin. If the Bible was read to you up until this time, it was read to you in Latin. It didn't matter whether you understood a word of Latin or not. That's the way it was. And so there's this move around Europe. Hey, I'd like to be able to read the Bible in my own language for the first time in history. 1540, remember I said Jane Seymour had died. 1540, Henry marries Anne of Cleves, his fourth wife. She's the daughter of a German duke. That same year, in the summer, the punishment of execution, remember those 6 articles I mentioned? The punishment of death is removed for 5 of them, but it's left, if you do not believe in transubstantiation, you will be killed. And the others you can get away with without being killed. Now, interestingly, Henry's been married to Anne of Cleves, his fourth wife, for 6 months. He doesn't like her. What happened? Have you heard of Photoshop? Henry arranged the marriage. It had actually been arranged by the Archbishop of Canterbury. Henry saw a painting of her. Well, the painting had been photoshopped. And so Anne makes the trip. She has hundreds of servants with her and so on. She makes the trip to England. When Henry sees her, she doesn't look like the painting. He doesn't like Photoshop. And so after 6 months, he divorces wife number 4. And so this Photoshop can be a dangerous thing. And painters have been Photoshopping things for years. And he only met her a couple of days before they were married. In fact, when he first met her, he delayed the wedding for 2 days while he tried to figure out, is there some way I can get out of this? But there was no way to get out of it without offending Germany. So he had to marry her. So in July 9th, he divorces his fourth wife. July 28th, this is 3 weeks later, he marries wife number 5. This is Catherine Howard. She's 17, he's 49. And so there's a 32-year difference. Now, Thomas Cromwell, who was one of the highest officials in England, was the guy who had arranged this marriage with Anne of Cleves from Germany. Do you think Henry was happy with him? No. So on the same day, it's almost like a wedding gift, on the day that so he divorces Anne of Cleves from Germany. 3 weeks later, he marries Catherine Howard. On that day, on his wedding day, he has Thomas Cromwell beheaded. Because he was the one who had arranged the marriage with wife number 4, the photoshopped wife. He was not pleased with him. A little aside, 1541, the first New Testament in Hungarian is published. Same year, the first complete Bible in Swedish is published. In 1541, in May, Coverdale's Great Bible, did we see some pictures of it up there, Tim? The Great Bible, this is the one, all we know is it's big. Henry VIII authorizes this Bible, I've already mentioned this, the first time in history that a Bible can be read in an English church in English. Not only that, Henry commands that a copy of the Bible be placed in every church in England. Now, the nickname for this Bible is the Chained Bible, because you put this big Bible in every church on a stand, somebody might steal it. And so they chained the Bible to the stand in every church. Well, this causes big-time problems. People are so eager to read a Bible because they usually couldn't afford one. They line up in lines for hours to be able to read a Bible in English. You have to stand in line to get a chance. The ministers start complaining, and remember at this time, people didn't read silently. If you read out loud. The ministers start complaining that people would rather read the Bible than listen to my sermons. They're lined up back there waiting a chance to read the Bible. They don't want to pay attention to my sermon. They just want to read the Bible. This is crazy. And so ministers not too impressed with this. Remember Catherine Howard, the 17-year-old girl, wife number 5? She gets her head chopped off 2 years later at the age of 19. Henry discovered before he married her, she had had a boyfriend. He wasn't her first boyfriend. And so that was grounds to get her head chopped off for the audacity of having a boyfriend before him. Not only she gets her head chopped off, but a lot of her relatives and friends also get killed because they hadn't let Henry know that the 17-year-old girl he was marrying had a boyfriend prior to him. Wife number 5 only lasted 2 years. Did we have a picture of her up there? Tim? Catherine Howard? I don't know if I had that in there or not. Maybe not. So that's sad. 1543, Henry signs a peace treaty with Scotland. To cement the deal, his 6-year-old son Edward gets engaged to the 6-month-old Mary, Queen of Scots. So they're now engaged. The groom is 6. The bride is 6 months old. Now, Mary, Queen of Scots became the Queen of Scotland at the age of 6 days. She was a queen when she was 6 days old. But then the Scots break the treaty 6 months later, so the wedding's off. 1543, the English Parliament passes a law called the Act for the Advancement of True Religion. So there's a bunch of parts to this law. It's a very important law. Here's some of them. In a church meeting, the Bible can only be read aloud by a person who has been personally appointed by the king. No one else in the church is allowed to stand up here and read the Bible out loud. The king has to personally appoint that individual. At home, clergymen, noblemen, and the gentry, which are rich people, they're a step below nobles, but they're above the rest of us. Those people are allowed to read the Bible to themselves or their families. Women of the gentry or nobles, they are allowed to read the Bible, which is amazing, in private, but not in public. They must not be seen reading the Bible. A woman reading the Bible? It would be a scandal. So they have to do it privately, and only the nobles or the gentry are allowed to do that. Anyone below the gentry rank, which is 90% of the population, it's illegal for you to read the Bible. So that law from 1409, the Constitution of Oxford, is still applicable. So 90% of the people in England, it is illegal for you to read the Bible. There may be some gentry or nobles here, I don't know. Jim? He's a member of the Board of Education, I don't know. He might squeak by there. As well in this, the Act for the Advancement of True Religion, all the writings of William Tyndale are outlawed. He wrote things other than this book. But Tyndale's New Testament is specifically, this is a quote from the Act, This book is clearly and utterly abolished and forbidden to be kept or used. That's a part of the act. 1523, just a couple of months after this act is passed, Henry marries wife number 6, Catherine Parr. She's 31, Henry's 52. Catherine is a Protestant believer. She narrowly escapes getting in serious trouble later, but manages to do so. Well, I would think so. Wife number 6, and not a good record for those who went before. Yeah, so I'd be certainly nervous. In 1545, a law is passed which makes it illegal to use any English Bible other than the Great Bible of 1539. So that's the one that's chained in the churches. That is the only legal Bible in England as the 1545. And in fact, officials of the government travel around the country trying to gather up every other Bible that's not the Great Bible to be burned. So only that Bible is allowed. That was Miles Coverdale. Yeah. That was his second attempt. 1545 to 1563, the Council of Trent is meeting in Italy. It's a gathering of the top leaders of the Roman Catholic Church. These meetings last for 18 years. That council decides that for any Roman Catholic, if you want to buy a Bible or read a Bible, you must get a license from the local Roman Catholic priest. So if you don't have a license and you buy a Bible or you read a Bible, you're in serious trouble. 1545, in March, Henry issues an order to increase the persecution of heretics. That means Protestants. Immediately, 23 people are arrested, including Anne Askew. We're going to see some pictures of her. Now, it's interesting. She's 23 when she gets arrested. She's 24 when she gets killed. But she's a very interesting person. I wrote a book called The Burning Time, which this English author, it's a woman, she had gone back through all sorts of trial transcripts and so on. It's fascinating, some of these trials. And one thing she mentions in the book is that once the person who's been arrested realizes, I'm doomed, they're going to kill me, they become very bold. Up until then, and Anne is an educated woman, and she spars very well against the various bishops. But when she realizes, I'm doomed, they're going to kill me anyway, then she becomes bold in some of the things. So she's arrested under the 6 Articles Act. Remember those 6 articles that I mentioned? Specifically the one about transubstantiation. During her trial, and someone was recording everything that happens during these trials, I thought this was an interesting line, and it's probably on one of these slides. He said, I would sooner read 5 lines in the Bible than hear 5 masses in the church. And so that's a pretty bold statement. So she's in and out of jail and stays there for a while. In 1546, they send her to the rack. I got some pictures there of what the rack is. You might have heard of the rack. Now, she's already been condemned to death by burning, and so it's actually technically illegal to torture her. Once you're going to be killed, what's the point of torturing a person? But the point of torturing her is the various officials, they want her to name names. They want her to give up other Protestants. Specifically, the Queen, Catherine Parr. She's teetering or skating on dangerous ice because she's a Protestant. She has Bible studies with her maids. And that's a very dangerous thing. And so there's officials who want Catherine Parr put away. And so they think if we torture Anne, she might give up the Queen as a person. When they put you on the rack, this is what happened to Anne. Now imagine, this is a 24-year-old girl. And so I realize that probably everyone in this room, if we'd lived then, we would be killed. I don't know how I would stand up to the torture. I suspect, well, this is my thinking on torture, that when you think about it, you think there's no way I could stand it. However, if you're in the midst of it, the Holy Spirit gives you grace. Somehow. They put Anne on the rack. Her arm bones, her upper arms are pulled out of the socket. So they're just dangling. Her elbows are dislocated. The bones are separated at the elbows. Her thigh bones at the hip are pulled out of the socket. Her knees are dislocated. They're pulled apart. Her whole body is demolished. But she doesn't give up anybody. So when it's time to burn her, she can't walk, of course, so they have to carry her to the stake. She can't stand up, obviously, so they set her on a chair and chain her to the stake. And there were 3 other men who were burned along with her. I think it was a means of being efficient, we'll say. Why waste all that fuel on just one person? We'll burn 4 people at the same time. And this is where there were manuals written about how to burn people at stake. It's very scientific. If you wanted a person to suffer more, then you control the fire so it's not as hot. And so you can roast a person more slowly rather than kill them in a fierce, quick fire. And so this was often done, depending on how angry the church authorities were with you, they could prolong the suffering. And this is where some reports say, I mentioned this last week, but I don't know, not all the things I read about this agree with this, but somebody perhaps bribed the executioner for all 4. Initially I thought it was just Anne, but it might have been all 4 of these people. He hung a little bag of gunpowder around their neck. And so when the flames got up to the neck, boom, it blew up and killed each of them quickly rather than a slow, more agonizing death. So that may or may not be true. And so she's quite an inspiration. I can't imagine, like those of you who have children. Michelle, how old is your daughter Indigo? Same age as Anne here. And so imagine this happening to Indigo. Yeah.
Well, just to recap, was it because she was a woman that they didn't like her, or a woman on top of the fact that she was standing up what she was doing?
Well, it's the specific reason is because she didn't believe in transubstantiation. But that comes from, this whole thing comes from, suddenly, for the first time in history, people can read the Bible in their own language. And so if you read this book I read called The Burning Time, has a whole chapter on her. And she is a Bible scholar. She knows that Bible forwards and backwards. She knows the Bible better than the bishops who were interviewing her in her trial. And she's very smart and canny until she realizes, I'm doomed, I might as well go for it.
Yeah.
And so she hits him with both barrels, sort of thing. And so it's all tied up with and this is why, remember last week we talked, and even the first week, the church just hated the idea of people getting the Bible in their own language. It's going to cause all sorts of trouble. And it did. They were right. Being able to read this book in your own language just throws everything on its head. The social order, the way things have been done in the church for 1,500 years. And so all of this is tied up with that. Transubstantiation. And so we might think, well, it's crazy. Why are you willing to die over a doctrine like this? But as some had said, well, I can't find it in this book, therefore I don't believe it. And they didn't accept the argument, well, it's tradition, therefore you better believe it. But that's what she was condemned for. Transubstantiation.
Well, essentially,
We don't hear that a lot.
As soon as you stop believing in one of the doctrines of the Catholic Church, all of a sudden you're saying that the line of authority doesn't matter.
Well, that's exactly, well, that's it. And so it's the authority issue at stake here. Am I going to believe the Bible, or am I going to go with what has happened throughout history and believe what I'm told to me? So, and I don't have it in my notes, but one of the arguments, it sounds like at that time when, well, there's a number of things mixed up with this, and part of it is the idea that when you have communion, that the priest is actually sacrificing Jesus again. There's this piece of bread literally becomes Jesus in actuality, and he's now being sacrificed again to redeem us from our sins. And Protestants were not agreeing with that, and this is one of the things Anne argued about, that she doesn't want to worship a piece of bread. She wants to worship Jesus. And one of her arguments was, if that piece of bread is God, then just set it over here for 3 months and let's see what happens to God. He's going to go moldy. And they didn't like her saying that. And so, you know, it's very doctrinal. To us seems like, what's the big deal? But it was a big deal because, like you said, Steve, it represents a whole line of authority. We just got a couple more things to mention here, and we're done. Are there any questions? 1546, another guy named Robert Stephen publishes his version of the Greek New Testament. And then in 1546, also the Council of Trent, the Roman Catholic conference that happened for 18 years in Italy, they decreed, and this seems like a bit of a backward step, they decide that the Latin Vulgate from 405 AD is the only official Bible of the Roman Catholic Church. No other version in any other language is to be used in any Roman Catholic country. So today I was saying, oh, we got an Italian Bible, we got a Swedish Bible, we got a Danish Bible, we got a Dutch Bible, etc. They decide, no, forget all that. We're going back to the Latin Vulgate, and you can only read the Bible in Latin. And that happened in 1546. Yes. This is it's called the Council of Trent, so this would be all the top officials. Well, we've been talking about two groups. In England, it's the Church of England at this point. And then in 1547, Henry VIII dies. He's 55 years old. He chooses to be buried with wife number 3. He's had 6 wives. So they bury him with Jane Seymour. And is there not an actress named Jane Seymour? Yes, that's who she's named after. And it must have been Henry's true love because of all his 6 wives, he's buried in the same tomb as Jane Seymour. So at that point, his son Edward, who was Jane Seymour's son, he becomes the king. He's 9 years old. And so next week, I'll carry on from there. We're going to talk about Edward VI. We're going to talk about Queen Mary I. And I hope we get to Elizabeth I. I don't know if we'll get to James I. And so between here and the King James Version, we've got King Edward, we've got Queen Mary. She earned the nickname Bloody Mary. Queen Elizabeth, and then King James, and it was under him that we get the King James Version. Now, any questions or comments? How are we doing for time? Okay. So again, did you have a question, Al?
No, just a comment that as of last week, you remember the 200 plus girls, African girls, who were kidnapped by Boko Haram.
Mm-hmm.
As of last week, many of them had been returned, recovered, but there's one that has been kept by the Muslims, by Boko Haram, because she will not give up Christianity. She will not stop believing in Christ. Out of 200 and some girls who were kidnapped, this one little girl is rocking things as far as Boko Haram is concerned.
So it reminds me of Anne Askew here. It's people at that time, as you can imagine, in general, didn't think much of women. But here's a 23-year-old girl who stands up for the full authority of the church and refuses to buckle because of what she believes. It's just amazing. Meanwhile, there's a lot of these top officials. It's like a pendulum swinging. Henry VIII initially believes this, and then he believes this, and then Edward VI, who comes along, he believes this, and then Queen Mary believes this, and then Elizabeth believes this, and then James believes this. A lot of these officials are like chameleons, and they're able to thread through various dangerous waters and manage to keep their head attached to their shoulders. Quite a few of them don't. And so they survived under one monarch, but under the next, what I believe then is no longer the doctrine du jour, and therefore they're killed. And this happens again and again and again. And so it's, I used to think it was people like Herod the Great and so on, and ancient kings you would hear, as soon as they come to power, they kill everybody who was a possible threat. It's still happening. And so people are getting killed left and right. And we've only heard about a few people. It's going to get worse next week as we really get into it, because we've only had a few people get killed so far.
I don't know if you touched on this or not, but King Henry seems to have changed his tune from prohibiting the Bible to allowing it. And I can't remember if you said why that happened. Do you know?
Well, there's a couple reasons. Number one is his various wives did have some influence on his thinking, especially this wife number 6, who, when the officials tortured Anne, they were trying to get her to give up wife number 6. And she knew this was afoot, and so she had actually cleared out any Protestant books that she had and pleaded with Henry because he was going to have her arrested. So anyway, she did have influence on Henry. Number 2 is a lot of church officials, such as the various people who were in the position of Archbishop of Canterbury, some of those over time had actually become Protestants. And so they had to tread very cautiously, but they were able to persuade Henry to allow certain things. So like Thomas Cranmer, he actually wrote a preface in the book, or Coverdale's Bible, the second edition. Now, that doesn't go over well with later, with Queen Mary. She has him killed for that. But certainly the fact that William Tyndale, as he's burned at the stake, he prays for King Henry. And within 1 year, God answers that prayer, which is pretty amazing. That's a quick time span. And so you picked up on an important point, because at the beginning of his reign, there's no way he would have allowed some of these things to happen. And by the end of his reign, there's a chained Bible in every single church. It's in English, and the church, the Bible that's read in a church service for the first time is actually in English instead of in Latin.
And it seems like he was a clear departure from the church guys of the day, because with the Council of Trent would have been the Church of England.
No, that's the Roman Catholic Church. Yeah. So we now have basically two churches. There's the Roman Catholic Church in the entire world, basically, and then because of Henry wanting this divorce, he had separated, at least as far as the Pope was concerned, into the Church of England. And so it's the Church of England that basically, for most of this time period, is still Roman Catholic in their thinking, but is gradually shifting, very gradually.
So it was the Catholic Church who reverted back to the Latin Bible, not the
Correct.
Church of England.
Correct.
I see.
So from the Council of Trent. So that's an 18-year meeting. You think some of the meetings here might be boring. Imagine going to a meeting that lasts for 18 years. So,
But in England, at the time it was the Church of England who was ruling at that time?
well, as I said, it's ultimately Henry, King Henry. And so there's various, the official head of the Church of England we think of today would be the Archbishop of Canterbury. Is that correct, Al? But above the Archbishop is the King. And so whatever the King thinks or says is what goes. And so gradually there's a softening, but obviously this happens just a year before Henry's death, that Anne is killed.
So how did we get to that as being vanity?
That is in the Roman Catholic Church from the Council of Trent. So
Robert, because I think the confusion is Henry allows the English Bible to come into English, right? England, but you said near his death he had one of the English Bibles burned.
he didn't like Tyndale.
Yeah, but was it Henry who had all the English Bibles burned?
Yes.
So
So-
there was a transition. He left the English Bibles in, but then he changed his mind.
Well, he didn't like certain English Bibles. So because Tyndale had opposed his divorce from his first wife, for the rest of his life, he hated Tyndale. And so there were certain English Bibles he liked. And even though the Bible he liked, the New Testament, was Tyndale's New Testament, but it had a different name on the front.
But didn't you say that in 1546 it was only Latin Bibles that were
That's in the Roman Catholic Church. So the Council of Trent in Italy decreed in 1546 that any Roman Catholic country it has to go back to using the Latin Bible from 405.
So that wouldn't reflect the England.
Right. And so we could have a talk like this for every country in Europe. And so in Spain, the things that happened there, last week we talked about the Spanish Inquisition. And so it happens, and so to save time, I'm avoiding talking about the entire history of Europe. There's things that happened in France and Spain, etc., etc. If we talked about them all, it'd take us quite a while. So we're just concentrating on England right now. And so what's going to happen, as I mentioned, there's going to be pendulum swings. So Edward VI, the son of Henry, he welcomes the Bible, but unfortunately he dies young. And then Queen Mary, the pendulum swings back. She doesn't want the Bible. She was. And then after that is Elizabeth, the pendulum sort of in the middle, and then King James comes from Scotland. He was an interesting character.
Elizabeth related to Mary?
A half sister. Yeah, so Mary was from the first wife, Elizabeth is from the second wife, and Edward's from the third wife. So they're half. Henry VIII.
Right.
Yeah.
The one who was the
Right. And it gets very interesting because Edward, who died of tuberculosis, and we'll get into this next week, he did not want the succession of kingship or royalty to pass to either of his sisters. So he passed it on to somebody named Lady Jane Grey, and she managed to be the queen for 9 days. Yeah. And then we'll talk next week about what happened to her. You can guess it wasn't good. Yeah.
Is that's the east for the
Yeah, well, she's very famous. She was the queen for 45 years.
She was known to be very bold.
Very strong, yeah. And she faced down, well, during her reign, for example, the Spanish Armada. Spain wanted to conquer England, and she had smallpox when she was younger, and so her skin was horribly pitted. So she's the one, you might have seen pictures, she wears very heavy makeup on her face, and the smallpox also made her lose most of her hair, so she always wore a wig and very heavy makeup and gigantic dresses. Dresses.
Have you seen the picture I'm talking about? That, maybe like I'm not sure how far back, but it's called Elizabeth.
Yeah, I haven't seen the movie. But there's a famous British actress played her. I can't think of her name right now. Yeah. So hopefully we get to her next week. So the reason some people might think, well, this is gory. Why are you talking about all this horrible stuff? But part of it is the idea, at least in my mind, of honoring people who have gone before us that have made it possible for us to have the Bible in English. And they paid a high price, and quite often that price was their life. And so most of us know nothing about it, and to realize, wow, hundreds of people died so that I can actually read the Bible in my own language. And if you start thinking about all of Europe, it's not hundreds, it's thousands, it's tens of thousands of people died so that in each country you can actually read the Bible in your own language. Otherwise, we would still be reading in Latin. I'd have to learn Latin. Yes?
Who did Martin Luther come with?
Well, he was part of the instigator of the whole thing.
He was around.
He was in Germany, 1519. He pounded a nail in the church of Wittenberg's door, Halloween night. And so that's the official beginning of the Reformation, which then spread out very quickly. And so I mentioned Thomas Bilney got arrested. Well, he probably had a book by Martin Luther and probably had this book as well, and got him thrown in jail and later eventually killed.
Martin was known for his reformist more theology.
Very theological. He was very bold sort of person, and he did change his theology from when he was young to when he was old. It's quite interesting to see what happens there. Any other questions? Yeah.
I think you mentioned, I can't remember, was when Henry was the head of the Church of England, was his personal lifestyle reflected any of the rules for his own clergy?
Which king?
Henry VIII.
So Henry VIII. Henry VIII was a scoundrel.
Yeah, but I'm saying, was his personal lifestyle reflected in the
Oh.
way he treated his clergy? I mean, were they bound by celibacy laws and things like that?
Many of these priests had wives on the side, and so they would have illegitimate children. And then it was a very political system where, if you had money, you could do anything you wanted, basically. And so that's a very good question, and if you read into it, a lot of and this is part of the confrontation. This goes back to the Anabaptists in Switzerland, for example, where they had this theory and this is why they practiced baptism. They were called Anabaptists, meaning baptize again. They thought that being a Christian should be more than just, I happen to be born in Canada, therefore I'm a Christian, that you should actually have a relationship with Jesus. That was a new idea. They paid a heavy price for that. And part of their thinking was not only should I actually have a personal relationship with Jesus and then get baptized, but I should attempt to live a holy life. That was a new idea as well. And Martin Luther, he had problems with that because he still believed in the idea of Christendom, that everybody in the whole country is a Christian and you practice infant baptism. That's what gets you into the church, infant baptism. And he wrote about this, that, well, if you have to live a holy life, there'd be nobody left in the church. And so his theory was, and initially he did believe that, but he changed when he realized the implications that if I'm saying that only born again people are part of the church and they have to live a holy life, who's left? There's nobody left. And so he actually changed his thinking towards the end, thinking, okay, everybody's in. And the church is just everybody. Some may be better than others.
Well, you mentioned infant baptism. I came up to the Catholic Church and we were taught that unbaptized children ended up in purgatory.
Mm-hmm.
That was their fault. What happened after that? I don't
Yeah.
remember.
And I grew up in the Anglican church, and I still remember, I was telling Jim just the other day, I grew up in the Anglican church. I became a born-again Christian when I was 15. I was baptized in water when I was 16. And when I told my Anglican parents that, Michelle knew my parents, they were just furious. All my stuff about being a Christian meant nothing, and they heard I'd been baptized. Oh, you were baptized when you were a baby. And so that was some kind of break for them, that I'd actually gotten baptized as a teenager in the Noire River. And the person who baptized me, they hated him for the rest of his life. And he's still alive. Jim and I went to visit him in a nursing home on Monday. 96. You know him. Glenn Shaver. Not well. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah, he's still alive, but he's, yeah. So why don't we officially end it? If you have further questions, I'll stick around for a while. So next week, we'll push on. We're going to start with Edward becoming the king, and we'll see what happens. We'll get to Queen Mary for sure.
Anybody who was involved in printing or distributing the Bibles to see those bonfires, eh?
Oh,
It's
imagine.
been hard work.
Yeah, such hard work. And then, although I read about Tyndale, because he kept revising his New Testament, I think he actually arranged to have the Bishop of London buy a bunch of his New Testaments so he could get the money to afford to print his next edition. So he knew they were going to be burnt, but hey, I just made a bunch of money. I can now afford to have the next edition printed. It was his thinking. So, it was very pragmatic, I guess. There, but yeah, the idea, like I can't imagine burning a Bible, especially for the church to be burning a Bible.